Hi everyone, here's the Book Chemist once again. Today I'm reviewing The Code of the Woosters by P.G. Wodehouse. I don't really do it anymore, but for a while I used to volunteer in an Oxfam bookshop, which is a second-hand charity bookshop. And the way we arranged fiction in the shop always rubbed me the wrong way. We had a crime section, we had a fantasy and science fiction section, which is fine. I don't mind dividing stock between genres. But then we had a fiction section and a literature section. The idea was that literature was supposed to be the classics. You wouldn't put Jane Austen or Chaucer in the fiction section, and you wouldn't put the obligatory 50 Shades of Grey in the literature section, which of course left quite a lot of authors, especially canonical authors from the early 20th century, which created endless debates. How did we deal with those? Mostly we tended to optimize shelf space. If there was space in the fiction section, they would go there. If there was space on the literature bookshelf, they would go there instead. Which I love as a story because immediately, in a nutshell, it tells you how these debates, these matters of high culture versus low culture, one genre against the next, are always, but always tied, as most everything else, to very base commercial concerns, to ideas of pushing merchandise onto people that, and sorry if I'm being a hopeless aesthete, in my opinion should have nothing to do with the higher realm of fiction, which should be beyond these earthly concerns. The one author that I remember caused the most bitterness in the shop was P.G. Wodehouse. The manager didn't consider him literature, but quite a few of the other volunteers, especially the old-timers who'd read him in their youth, actually thought he was he should be canonized and he should be ascribed to the honors of the literature shelf. What do I think, is the question. P.G. Wodehouse has been on my radar for a long time, but I was never sure whether I would appreciate him, or even just, considering how famous he is as a comic writer, if I would find him funny. In Italy at least, and I think it's the same in the rest of the world, we have this idea that British humor is a bit strange, is quite off-kilter. To this day I cannot really stand a full Monty Python movie. I find the humor bizarre and disorienting. But from the very first pages of The Code of the Woosters, I was immersed in the writing and I loved the constant humor, the constant hilarity, the subdued kind of irony that permeates the narrator and protagonist's retelling of the events at Totley Towers. Of this strange, is it a weekend, is it 2-3 days that he had, where he spent all of his time chasing a glorified cream jug that somehow threatened to get him into jail and to ruin the life of a few other people. That was an absurd synopsis, but that's because it's kind of an absurd plot, and even more than absurd, the plot in The Code of the Woosters is blown out of all proportions. This is the story of a few rich people trying to get their hands on a rather ugly piece of silverware, and the consequences of this quest for all of the people involved are pretty major. And that is incredible, and I'll tell you why in a second. First, let me stress again how rich, how lush, how satisfying the narrative style of this book was. The novel could have been about pretty much anything at all. I would have had so much fun with it. The inside jokes that carry on from one paragraph to the next, the manners of speech of Bertie Wooster, the narrator, the way his descriptions of other characters are clearly tinged by his own sympathies or antipathies, is even more than hilarious and laugh-out-loud fun, although there are quite a few hilarious moments in the book, make no mistake. It's the kind of narration, the kind of novel that you read with a grin on your face from page 1 to the very last one. If you like rich, even Baroque writing, if you like people like HP Lovecraft or Michael Chabon or Thomas Pynchon and the other postmoderns, if you like writers in general who use 10 words where 2 would suffice, then you must read P.G. Wodehouse. He is one. From my very limited experience of his oeuvre, just from The Code of the Woosters, I was blown away by the way he employs and plays and twists the English language. Let's go back to the plot, to the idea of how blown out of proportion, how exaggerated the plot of this book is. I think the greatest achievement of the Code of the Woosters is its world building. Every novel or short story, every piece of fiction creates its own world from scratch. Even the blandest, most predictable failing marriage Canadian literary short story set in the absolute real world we're all living in the unwritten world, for lack of a better term and for absolute clarity, even those stories have to create the entire world from scratch. There are a few mechanisms, both cognitive and narratological, that allow us to listen to a story without having to get a full account of everything that makes up that world. One of these is the so-called principle of minimal departure, developed and theorized by Marie-Laure. I will put a few links in the description box if you're interested in narratology. But the basic idea is that when someone tells you a story about a man walking in the woods, you assume that that man is going to have 2 legs and 2 arms, and that the woods are going to be made up of trees, and that the leaves on the trees are going to be green, because that's what usually happens in the unwritten world, and so you assume that this story is going to depart as little as possible from your experience of the unwritten world. I was at a reading once with children's literature gods Mac Barnett and John Klassen, where they interrogated some kids about what happens in one of their picture books called Sam and Dave Dig a Hole. It's great, read it if you can, it's amazing, I love it. And the characters in this picture book, at one point in the picture book, something happens to them, and it's not very clear whether the world they inhabit in the first page and in the last page is the same. And the authors interrogated Mac and John asked the kids what was going on in the book, and some of the kids suggested that maybe the book doesn't really take place on Earth at all, because at the end of the day it says nowhere in the book that the events we're reading happen on planet Earth. And Mac Barnett joked that, of course, if the book doesn't say that in the first line, then it's not true. Because The Orchard Keeper by Cormac McCarthy doesn't start with a sentence that goes, "The tree was down and cut to lengths. The sections spread and jumbled over the grass." On Earth, we have no idea to know where or on what planet this book is set. Which is fun, and of course it's kind of a joke, but at the same time it also isn't. It's what allows some interesting bits of horror fiction and science fiction to be so effective, most notably stuff like The Monsters by Robert Sheckley, or even more The Outsider by HP Lovecraft. Both of which, by the way, I'm positive all of you already know. If you don't, there are links in the description box. You're going to have a pretty incredible half hour. You're welcome. Most books that are set in worlds that are significantly different from ours, not necessarily fantasy fiction, even just books that deal with a fictional town or with a pretty peculiar family that differs from most normal families, whatever those are, most of those books have to spend quite a lot of time giving you the details of how these micro-worlds, these microcosms work. When authors are really genius and when books are truly incredible, the language itself, the prose itself, takes care of the world building for the writer. That's why the best example of world building I've ever encountered is the Yiddish Policeman Union by Michael Chabon, which is set in this fictional Jewish state in Alaska, where you do get descriptions of the city of Sitka, where the novel's events take place. You do get descriptions of the skyscrapers there and some of the neighborhoods, but it's the language of Sitka, of this fictional Jewish Alaska, it's the language itself, the way the novel is narrated, that helps you visualize what's going on, that helps you inhabit this fictional state for the duration of your reading experience. Michael Moorcock does something similar in Eldrick of Melniboné. P.G. Wodehouse in The Code of the Wooster would be in my top 5 world builders, because what it does is create a world where these petty, silly concerns were securing possession of a really shitty cream jug shaped like a cow or something, were risking losing part of your stuff, risking losing your French chef. These are things that people are ready to go to jail for, people are ready to, dare I say, almost risk their lives for. And this is all very silly, it's all very hilarious, but it's also kind of satirical at the same time. It would be amazing to read the Code of the Woosters through a Marxist perspective. Footmen and other servants are present in the novel, but they're either dealt with as utensils maybe or appliances, stuff you have to own and possess, or they just linger on the edge of Bertie's vision. At one point the narrator Bertie actually makes a joke about footmen not being very visible to him. They kind of hover and wobble in his field of vision, but he doesn't really see them at all. And of course Jeeves, Bertie's butler, stands in for the sensible, witty, common, uncommon man who eventually saves the day. Although I would argue that Jeeves, even more than a stand-in for the common, genuine people, is kind of a stand-in for the writer in how he stirs the action toward certain tracks when everything threatens to just fall apart and there seems to be no resolution to how the novel's events are progressing. But anyway, this should give you a sense of how beautifully, how rich the Code of the Woosters is, how it sets your imagination on fire as you're reading it, how I loved the way it portrayed this world of the rich, world of the upper classes, in a way that shows its artificiality, its terrible flaws and its perversions, because that's what they are, and allows you at the end of the day, once you finish the book and set it aside, to look at people who actually live in that world, people who actually obsess over silly shit, under a different light, and maybe reconsider yourself and the way you look at your collection of cow-shaped silverware or cream jugs or whatever, and see if maybe you're not losing track of priorities. And even if you don't do that, you should. You haven't gotten everything out of the book that you should have, but you will still have had an incredible experience and enjoyed some of the best English writing I've ever encountered. Definitely some of the best British writing I've ever encountered. I would, if I went back to the Oxfam, I would definitely put Wodehouse on the literature shelf while the manager wasn't looking. What do you think of P.G. Wodehouse and the Code of the Woosters in particular? I can't wait to read more of Wodehouse over. I know he's written an immense array of books. I would like to read more of Bertie and Jeeves' adventures, I think, because I enjoyed the characters so much, but I would also like to try some others of his novels. Please give me suggestions about great P.G. Wodehouse novels, other books of his that I should definitely check out, and please let's discuss everything I've talked about in the video in the comment section below. Thank you as always for watching the video, guys. Bye, guys.